The room is lit by a single lamp. It's 2:47 a.m. in Basel, Switzerland, November 1974. 6 men sit around a polished mahogany table in a building most people have never heard of, the Bank for International Settlements. There are no cameras, no journalists, no public record of what's being discussed. Outside, the world is burning. Oil prices have quadrupled. Inflation in Britain has hit 24%. American families are lining up at gas stations, sometimes for hours, only to find the pumps dry. The post-war economic miracle is collapsing in real time. And in this room, behind closed doors, these central bankers are making a decision that will reshape the relationship between governments and their citizens for the next 50 years. One of them, his name lost to history, his face never photographed, leans forward and says something that won't appear in any official minutes. The public must never understand what we're about to do. What they did in that room and in countless meetings like it over the following decades wasn't a conspiracy in the traditional sense. It was something far more insidious. It was a choice, a conscious, calculated decision to use inflation not as an unfortunate side effect of monetary policy, but as a tool. A silent tax that requires no legislation, no public debate, no consent. A mechanism to transfer wealth from the many to the few, from savers to debtors, from citizens to the state, all while maintaining the fiction of stability. This is the story of how that choice was made, why it was necessary, or at least why they believed it was, and how it quietly stole a century of accumulated wealth from ordinary people who played by the rules, saved their money, and trusted the system. But the question that haunts this entire saga, the one we must confront before we can understand anything else, is this: when does managing an economy become theft? When does the preservation of order justify the betrayal of trust? To understand what happened in that Swiss conference room, we have to go back to a time when money meant something different, when a dollar, a pound, a franc wasn't just paper backed by promises, but a claim on something real. Gold. For most of human history, this was the anchor. Governments couldn't simply create money at will because money represented a finite resource. If you wanted to spend more, you needed more gold. This created constraints, painful constraints. During wars, economic crises, and depressions, governments found themselves handcuffed by this golden reality. They couldn't just print their way out of problems. And so, gradually, with each crisis, the handcuffs were loosened. The first major break came during World War I. Britain, France, Germany, they all needed to fund unprecedented military operations. They suspended gold convertibility, promising it was temporary. It wasn't. The war ended, but the habit of monetary expansion had begun. By the 1930s, the Great Depression forced another reckoning. Countries abandoned the gold standard one by one, desperate to inflate their way out of deflation, to devalue their currencies and make exports competitive. Franklin Roosevelt made it illegal for Americans to own gold in 1933, forcing them to exchange it for paper dollars at a fixed rate, then immediately revalued gold upward, effectively confiscating a portion of every citizen's wealth in a single legislative stroke. But the true turning point, the moment when the architecture of modern inflation was built, came in 1944. World War II was still raging, but Allied victory seemed inevitable. And so, in the mountain resort of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 nations gathered to redesign the global financial system. The question on the table was deceptively simple. What comes next? The answer was the Bretton Woods Agreement. The U.S. dollar would become the world's reserve currency, backed by gold at $35 per ounce. Every other currency would peg to the dollar. America, now holding 70% of the world's monetary gold, would guarantee convertibility. If you had dollars, you could exchange them for gold. It seemed stable. It seemed permanent. It was neither. What they didn't account for, or perhaps what they chose to ignore, was human nature. The temptation of power. By the 1960s, America was fighting a war in Vietnam and funding Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs simultaneously. Guns and butter, as the saying went. Massive spending without raising taxes proportionally. The Treasury began printing more dollars than it had gold to back them. At first, the discrepancy was small, manageable, but other countries noticed. France especially. Charles de Gaulle, never one to trust American promises, began demanding gold in exchange for the dollars France had accumulated. French ships literally sailed to New York Harbor and loaded up with American gold. Other nations followed. The fiction was unsustainable. By 1971, the United States had perhaps $8 billion in gold reserves, but owed foreign governments over $60 billion in dollar-denominated obligations. The arithmetic was undeniable. And so, on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on television and announced what he called a temporary suspension of dollar convertibility into gold. He spoke for 11 minutes. The word temporary appeared once. The suspension has never been lifted. In that single televised address, the last tether between major currencies and physical reality was severed. Money became purely fiat, from the Latin, let it be done, existing solely because governments declared it to be so. This was the foundational shift, the moment when inflation transformed from a periodic problem into a permanent feature of the system. Because now, there are no constraints, no gold reserves to deplete, no external reality to check monetary expansion. Just faith, just trust in institutions that had already proven willing to break their promises when convenient. What followed in the 1970s was chaos. With currencies unmoored, governments discovered they could finance spending simply by creating new money. And they did. Oil shocks in 1973 and 1979 provided convenient scapegoats, but the underlying disease was monetary. Central banks, pressured by governments hungry for revenue without the political cost of raising taxes, let the printing presses run. Inflation in the United States peaked at 14.8% in 1980. In the United Kingdom, it hit 24.2% in 1975. People's savings, accumulated over lifetimes, were being vaporized. $1 in 1970 could buy what required $2.50 by 1980. Anyone who had saved conservatively, who had trusted that their government wouldn't debase the currency, found themselves betrayed. Their crime? Doing exactly what they were told was responsible. But here's what's rarely discussed. Who benefited? The answer is debtors. Specifically, the largest debtor of all, governments themselves. When you borrow money and then inflate the currency, you pay back the debt with money that's worth less than what you borrowed. It's a hidden default. A quiet jubilee for those in power, paid for by everyone who held cash or fixed-income investments. The wealth didn't disappear. It was transferred, from savers to borrowers, from the old to institutions, from the prudent to the profligate. And the mechanism was inflation, specifically inflation rates that exceeded the interest rates paid on safe investments. Your bank account might have paid 5% interest, but if inflation was 10%, you were losing 5% of your purchasing power every year. Compounded over a decade, that's devastating. This wasn't accidental. In 1974, when those central bankers met in Basel, they knew exactly what they were doing. The minutes that do exist, heavily redacted, released decades later, show discussions of acceptable inflation ranges and public tolerance thresholds. They were calibrating, testing how much wealth they could extract before people rioted. The turning point came with Paul Volcker. Appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979, Volcker was given a mandate: break inflation's back, whatever the cost. He raised interest rates to unprecedented levels. At one point, the prime rate hit 21.5%. The immediate effect was catastrophic. The economy plunged into recession. Unemployment soared. Businesses failed. Farmers lost their land. But inflation collapsed. From 14.8% in March 1980 to 2.5% by July 1983. Volcker had won, or so the story goes. But what actually happened was more subtle. Volcker didn't eliminate inflation. He normalized it. He established a new equilibrium where 2 to 3% annual inflation became the target, the goal, the sign of a healthy economy. Think about what that means. 2% annual inflation means your money loses half its value every 35 years. If you're 20 years old and you save diligently for retirement, the dollars you put away will buy half as much when you're 55. This became official policy. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England all adopted explicit inflation targets around 2%. They called it price stability. But stability means unchanging. 2% annual inflation is the opposite of stability. It's managed decline, predictable confiscation, and yet it was sold to the public as responsible monetary policy. The brilliance of this arrangement is its invisibility. When a government raises income taxes, people notice. They protest. They vote out politicians. But when the government inflates the currency by 3% annually, the effect is diffused, delayed, and difficult to trace. Prices rise gradually. Wages sometimes keep pace, sometimes don't. People blame greedy corporations, foreign competition, bad luck. They rarely blame the central bank. This is why inflation has been called the cruelest tax. It falls hardest on those who can least afford it. The wealthy hold assets, stocks, real estate, businesses that often appreciate during inflationary periods. The poor and middle class hold cash, modest savings accounts, fixed pensions. Their wealth is denominated in the very currency being debased. They have nowhere to hide. Let me show you what this looks like in human terms. Meet Margaret Thompson. She's not real, but she represents millions who are. Born in 1945, Margaret grew up in post-war Britain, taught that hard work and saving were the path to security. She worked as a school teacher for 40 years, contributing to a pension plan and keeping emergency savings in a building society account. When she retired in 2005 at age 60, her pension was fixed, a guaranteed monthly payment of £1,200. Her savings totaled £50,000, which felt substantial. Safe. In 2005, £1,200 covered her rent, utilities, groceries, and left enough for occasional luxuries. The $50,000 was her buffer against disaster. But then, something happened. Actually, nothing dramatic happened, which was the problem. Inflation just continued. Quietly. Predictably. At the Bank of England's target rate of 2% annually. By 2025, 20 years later, Margaret is 80. Her pension still pays £1,200 per month. But that same basket of goods that cost her a certain amount in 2005 now costs roughly 50% more. Her rent has increased. Her heating bills have doubled. Her grocery costs have exploded, especially after the inflationary surges of 2021 to 2023. That £1,200 buys what £800 bought when she retired. Her savings? That £50,000 has lost a third of its purchasing power, even sitting in an account earning interest, because the interest never kept pace with inflation. Margaret didn't make bad decisions. She didn't gamble on cryptocurrencies or invest in failed ventures. She did everything right according to the rules she was taught, and she was still systematically impoverished by monetary policy. Multiply Margaret by millions. Across Britain, America, Europe, Japan. An entire generation of people who saved responsibly, who trusted the system, who believed that money in the bank was safe, found themselves betrayed not by a sudden crisis, but by the steady, invisible corrosion of their currency's purchasing power. If stories like this fascinate you, if you want to understand the hidden mechanisms that shape our economic reality, consider leaving a like. It helps bring more of these buried truths to light. Now, the defenders of the system, and they're numerous, credentialed, persuasive, will tell you that moderate inflation is necessary, that it encourages spending rather than hoarding, that it allows for labor market flexibility because employers can give small nominal raises while real wages stagnate, avoiding the political difficulty of wage cuts, that it reduces the real burden of debt over time, making mortgages more manageable for homeowners. And there's truth in these arguments. An economy stuck in deflation, where prices fall year after year, can spiral into depression as people defer purchases, expecting lower prices later, causing businesses to fail and employment to collapse. Japan's lost decades are often cited as a cautionary tale. But here's what they don't say. The choice isn't between 2% inflation and deflation. There's a middle ground. Zero inflation. true price stability. This was possible under gold standards and could theoretically be maintained under fiat systems with strict rules and central bank independence. But it requires discipline. It requires telling governments no when they want to spend beyond their means. It requires enduring recessions without the monetary cushion of inflation. It requires, in short, political courage that has been absent for a century. Because the dirty secret is that inflation serves those in power. Governments are the largest debtors in modern economies. America's national debt exceeds $35 trillion. The United Kingdom's debt-to-GDP ratio hovers around 100%. Japan's exceeds 250%. These debts are nominally denominated. Every year of inflation erodes their real value. Taxpayers think they're honoring the national debt through their taxes, but actually, much of it is being paid off through the invisible tax of currency debasement. The bondholders, often foreign governments, pension funds, insurance companies, are being quietly shortchanged, and there's nothing they can do about it. The financial crisis of 2008 made all of this explicit. When Lehman Brothers collapsed and the global financial system teetered on the brink, central banks faced a choice. Let the system fail, endure a catastrophic depression, cleanse the malinvestment and moral hazard from the economy through a painful but honest reckoning. Or intervene. Print money on a scale never before attempted. Bail out the banks. Suppress interest rates to zero. Inflate asset prices. Prevent the market from disciplining reckless behavior. They chose the latter. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from under $1 trillion in 2008 to $4.5 trillion by 2015 through quantitative easing, a euphemism for creating money and using it to buy government bonds and mortgage-backed securities. The European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England all followed the same playbook. They called it necessary. They called it saving the economy. And perhaps in the narrow sense of preventing immediate collapse, they succeeded. But at what cost? The money they created didn't flow to Margaret Thompson. It flowed to banks, to financial institutions, to those who owned assets. Stock markets soared. Real estate prices exploded. The wealthy, who hold these assets, became dramatically wealthier. Meanwhile, ordinary people saw their wages stagnate, their savings earn zero interest, and their cost of living, particularly housing, become increasingly unaffordable. The wealth gap expanded not because of capitalism in the traditional sense, but because of monetary policy. Because central banks chose to inflate asset prices as a way of creating a wealth effect that would supposedly trickle down to everyone else. It didn't. Inequality reached levels not seen since the 1920s. And the mechanism was inflation. Not the consumer price inflation that hits everyone, but asset price inflation that benefits only those who already own assets. This is a crucial distinction. Central banks claim to target consumer price inflation at 2%, but they largely ignore asset price inflation. Stocks, bonds, real estate, these can inflate at 5, 10, even 20% annually, and central banks shrug, calling it market dynamics. But these two forms of inflation are intimately connected. When you create trillions in new money, it has to go somewhere. And where it goes is into assets, bidding up their prices, making the wealthy wealthier, and making it impossible for young people to afford homes, to build wealth, to participate in the same economic opportunities their parents had. Then came 2020, the pandemic, lockdowns, economic collapse, and a response? More of the same, but on steroids. Governments borrowed unprecedented sums. Central banks printed unprecedented amounts. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet exploded to nearly $9 trillion. Helicopter money, stimulus checks sent directly to citizens, became reality. And for a brief moment, it seemed to work. Markets rebounded. Unemployment fell. People had money to spend. But then, in 2021, inflation returned. Real inflation, the kind people notice, the kind that shows up in grocery bills and gas prices and rent. By 2022, inflation in the United States hit 9%, the highest in 40 years. In the United Kingdom, it peaked above 11%. Europe faced similar surges. Central banks insisted this was transitory, a temporary consequence of supply, chain disruptions, and pandemic-related anomalies. They were wrong, or they were lying. Because the truth is, when you create trillions in new currency and distribute it while production is constrained, prices will rise. This is not controversial economics. This is arithmetic. The money supply expanded by over 25% in 2 years. Of course, there was inflation. And once again, who paid? Not the governments that borrowed. Not the banks that were bailed out. Not the wealthy whose assets appreciated. It was the middle class. The workers on fixed salaries whose raises didn't keep pace. The elderly on pensions. The savers whose bank accounts earned a pittance while their purchasing power evaporated. The inflation of 2021 to 2023 represented one of the largest wealth transfers in modern history. Comparable in scale to the 1970s, but this time it happened faster and hit a population that had already been squeezed by decades of wage stagnation and rising costs. So here we are, a century after the Federal Reserve's founding in 1913, 54 years after Nixon closed the gold window, 16 years after the financial crisis, 4 years after pandemic stimulus. And what do we have to show for it? A monetary system where currency debasement is not a bug, but a feature. Where central banks explicitly target inflation, meaning they explicitly target the gradual confiscation of citizens' purchasing power. Where asset prices have been inflated to the point that home ownership is unattainable for much of the younger generation. Where government debts have reached levels that can never be repaid in real terms and will inevitably be inflated away. Where inequality has reached extremes that threaten social cohesion. And all of it has been done quietly, without debate, without consent, behind closed doors in Basel and Washington and London and Frankfurt. The decisions made by unelected technocrats whose names most people don't know, whose meetings aren't broadcast, whose reasoning is cloaked in economic jargon designed to obscure rather than illuminate. This is the theft, not a single dramatic heist, but a slow, methodical extraction of wealth spanning generations. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Since 1913, the U.S. dollar has lost approximately 97% of its purchasing power. What required $1 then requires over $30 now. A middle-class family in 1950 could buy a home for twice their annual income. Today, it's often 5 or 6 times, sometimes more. A university education that cost a few $1,000s now costs hundreds of thousands. Healthcare, childcare, every fundamental necessity has outpaced wage growth, not because of inherent scarcity or technological limits, but because the currency itself has been systematically debased while asset prices have been artificially inflated. The social contract has been broken. People were told, work hard, save, invest conservatively, and you'll be secure. But the rules changed. Saving became penalized through negative real interest rates. Conservative investment earned less than inflation. The only way to preserve wealth was to take risk, to speculate, to leverage, to play the same games as Wall Street. And most people can't do that. Don't know how to do that. Shouldn't have to do that. The system has been rigged, not through overt corruption, though there's been plenty of that, but through monetary policy that serves the interests of governments and financial institutions at the expense of ordinary citizens. And here's the most disturbing part. It's accelerating. The pandemic response proved that there are no limits anymore. When crisis hits, central banks will do whatever it takes. Print however much is needed. The discipline that existed even 20 years ago, the reluctance to expand balance sheets too aggressively, the fear of inflation, all of it evaporated. Modern monetary theory, once a fringe idea, has gained mainstream acceptance, arguing that governments can't run out of money because they print it, so the only constraint is inflation itself. Which sounds reasonable until you realize it means there's no constraint at all, because by the time inflation becomes undeniable, the wealth has already been transferred. The next crisis, and there will be a next crisis, will likely see even more extreme measures. Central bank digital currencies are being developed, which would give governments unprecedented control over money supply and even individual transactions. Negative interest rates, once thought impossible, have been implemented in Europe and Japan. There's talk of helicopter money becoming permanent, of universal basic income funded by money printing. Each of these ideas might sound appealing in isolation, but they all share one feature. They expand the power of central banks to create money and therefore to inflate. The trajectory is clear. We're not moving toward more monetary stability. We're moving toward less, toward a system where money is increasingly divorced from any constraint, where the temptation to solve every problem by printing more becomes irresistible, where the value of currency becomes purely a matter of confidence. And confidence, once lost, is nearly impossible to restore. So what do we do? That's the question, isn't it? Because understanding the problem doesn't solve it. You can't individually opt out of the monetary system. You can't refuse to use debased currency. You can try to protect yourself, buying real assets, investing in stocks, even cryptocurrencies, though each comes with its own risks. But these are individual solutions to a collective problem. The real solution would require something almost unimaginable: discipline, a return to rules-based monetary policy, constitutional constraints on money creation, central banks that are truly independent, not from politicians, but from the temptation to inflate, a recognition that money should be a store of value, not a tool of policy. But this would require governments to give up power voluntarily, to accept that they can't spend beyond their means, to endure recessions without the cushion of inflation, to tell voters hard truths about trade-offs and sacrifice. When in human history has that happened? When has an institution with the power to create wealth out of thin air chosen not to use it? The more likely scenario is that we continue down this path until something breaks, until inflation becomes so severe that the currency loses credibility entirely, until the social fabric tears under the strain of inequality and broken promises, until some crisis forces a reset, a return to sound money, the way the 1970s inflation forced the Volcker shock, the way the Great Depression forced the New Deal, the way World War I forced the end of the old gold standard. History suggests these resets are violent, chaotic, and punish the innocent along with the guilty. But they're also necessary. Systems built on lies can't last forever. We started in a room in Basel, in the darkness of a crisis, with men making decisions they believed were necessary. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps the alternative, a global depression, political upheaval, the collapse of the post-war order, would have been worse. We can't know. What we can know is the cost. A century of wealth, accumulated through the labor and sacrifice of millions, quietly transferred through the mechanism of inflation. Families impoverished, futures stolen, trust betrayed. And the question we posed at the beginning, the one we must now confront, hasn't changed. When does managing an economy become theft? Is it theft if it's legal? If it's done by legitimate institutions? If it's explained with sophisticated economic theories? Or is theft simply taking what doesn't belong to you without consent, regardless of the mechanism? The people who saved their money didn't consent to having its value eroded. They were never asked. They were never told clearly what was happening until it was too late. And now here we are, watching the same patterns repeat, faster and more extreme, wondering if this time will be different, knowing it probably won't. The central bankers still meet in Basel. The conferences still happen behind closed doors. The monetary expansion continues. And somewhere, right now, another Margaret Thompson is putting her savings into a bank account, trusting that it will be there when she needs it, not knowing that with every passing year, every 2% inflation target hit, she's being robbed so gradually she'll never notice until it's too late. What would you have done if you were in their place? If you were Paul Volcker in 1979, or Ben Bernanke in 2008, or Jerome Powell in 2020, with the power to create money and the pressure to use it, would you have chosen differently? Would you have let the system burn for the sake of principle, even knowing the human cost? Tell me in the comments. And if you crave more stories that pull back the curtain on the hidden mechanisms of power, the decisions made in shadows that shape the world we inherit, subscribe. Because the next one might just change how you see not only history, but the quiet theft happening right now, in real time, while everyone's looking somewhere else.